Good evening. My name is Monique Lyle, and I'm the Deputy Director for the Center for Civil Rights History and Research here at the University of South Carolina. Welcome, and thank you for joining us here tonight for a fireside chat. You can just sort of imagine a crackling fire behind me. For a fireside chat with Nashville historian and author, Dr. Rachel Louise Martin. I know that we're all very excited to hear more about Dr. Martin's most recent outstanding book, A Most Tolerant Little Town, which chronicles, quote, the explosive beginning of school desegregation, end quote, in America, by recounting the stories and experiences of the residents of the small Appalachian town of Clinton, Tennessee, and the first school to attempt court-mandated desegregation in the wake of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Before we begin, I would like to thank the co-sponsors for tonight's event, including Dr. Gloria Boutte and the School of Education here at the University of South Carolina, and of course our host for tonight's event, the Joseph F. Rice School of Law. Also, I want to alert all of you to a couple of upcoming book events that the Center for Civil Rights will be hosting at the Columbia Museum of Art. On February 18th, from 3 to 5 p.m., we're hosting Herb Frazier and Joseph McGill Jr. for a discussion of their book, Sleeping with the Ancestors, How I Followed the Footprints of Slavery, which recounts McGill's experience touring the country and spending the night in former slave dwellings. Then on February 25th, from 2 to 5 p.m., we're hosting David Nicholson for a discussion of his book, The Garretts of Columbia, A Black South Carolina Family from Slavery to the Dawn of Integration, which chronicles the rich history of one of South Carolina's most prominent African-American families. Both events will be followed by a book signing and reception. And again, both events will be held at the Columbia Museum of Art at 1515 Main Street, where guests can also view the center's Intersection on Main exhibit, which is an exhibit that highlights Black life in Columbia, centering on the Washington Street Black Business District from the 1870s through the 1970s. And the Intersection on Main exhibit at the Columbia Museum of Art is free of charge and open to the public. Tonight's conversation with Dr. Rachel Louise Martin will be moderated by Professor Derek Black, Director of the Constitutional Law Center here at the University of South Carolina's Rice School of Law, who is an expert in education law and policy, constitutional law, and civil rights. Professor Black will provide introductions of Dr. Martin. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Derek Black and Dr. Rachel Louise Martin.
Monique, and thanks. I was going to list all the sponsors. I won't list them again since you did, but thanks to College of Education, of course, and all the folks involved there, and Center for Civil Rights, and Dr. Donaldson for coming out, and Taylor Callahan and Holly James, who really exposed my organizational weaknesses and cover them up, and so they really did everything to make this possible, and I see one of them here. But there are probably other organizing things going on as well. So anyway, thanks to them for making this possible, and this is really exciting for me to have our author, Rachel Louise Martin, with us here. As some of you probably, if you looked around, you'd see she's got a very interesting background. And as a Tennessean, I will say, although we can't spare time, I think, to talk about hot chicken, I am fascinated because I didn't know that was a special thing in Nashville. In fact, I never heard, no offense, I never heard anybody say anything about the food in Nashville. It's just like, we talk about South Carolina this, but anyway, if we have time at the end, we can get there. But to me, the sort of story, your sort of career story is very important. I just want to, share that with students, because I also just think, like, the pathway of getting an education which made this possible, right? So she received her PhD in history at the University of North Carolina, but then took a position, a fellowship doing oral history. And what really sort of strikes me is, like, so much of the time we want instantaneous sort of results for things, but were it not for putting in that hard work on the front end, I imagine this book is nowhere close to possible. And that really, I think, goes to our public institutions making commitments for that type of work to be done, right? That doesn't just happen, if there's no fellowship. Although Daniela does seem to make things happen. So maybe Daniela could make some oral histories happen without a fellow, and she's looking in different directions. But in any event, really pleasure for her to be here and to share with us her path to getting here. And, the other part of this is she shared last night this 18 years in the making, right? So from PhD to fellowship.
It was not fast.
Wasn't fast. And it made me think of, and this would date me, maybe I am too young to be a Johnny Cash fan, but that made me think of that one piece at a time, I built that Chevrolet one piece at a time. It sounds like maybe this book was certainly at least one conversation at a time. With all that said, I'm really thrilled to have you here. This book grabbed me from the first moment, and so I want to turn it over to you and say, why don't you just kick us off by sharing with those who are unfamiliar with the story, what happened and why you chose to write about it.
Yeah, so this book did originate in 2005 as part of a research fellowship I had. I had been hired to go into all of these different tiny little towns on the other side of the Appalachians, so Tennessee, Alabama, a little bit in Mississippi and Kentucky, and I was supposed to do oral histories. They usually meant somewhere between 6 and 12 interviews. I'd transcribe them, send them back, then the local community could use those to start a museum or create a National Historic Registry, whatever they were trying to do. It was a way of expanding access to specifically history tourism was what we were working on, helping different communities who were not already in the archives, not usually celebrated, to begin making money off of their history in the way other people do already. And so that was what I was doing. And I was sent to Clinton, and it was supposed to be a 3-day visit, and then I was supposed to get out again. And I stayed basically for 18 years. Not all that time in Appalachia, thank heavens. I mean, it's a beautiful place, but I had always intended to be a writer. And I think that's where my story diverges from what a lot of my colleagues in graduate school were there for. A lot of my colleagues wanted to be a professor, and I love teaching. I actually really miss being part of an academic setting, but I wanted to write. And I didn't want to write in the ways that usually get someone tenure. I didn't want to write journal articles. I wanted to write for The Atlantic. And as a result, I started at some point moving my career toward what my dream was. It was terrifying. If I had known exactly what all it was going to take to make my dream come true, I might not have done it. But thankfully, I went into it without any knowledge whatsoever. And here we are. It's coming true at long last. So the story of Clinton, Tennessee, though, what really grabbed me is in 1956, there was this tiny little town. It's nevertheless, even though it's in the mountains, even though it was fewer than 10,000 people, in a way it was kind of the center of the world in 56. It's 7 miles from where Oak Ridge is, which is where you're from.
No, I'm from Clinton.
You're from Clinton. Why did I have you in Oak Ridge?
Patrick Kelly.
Oh my gosh, well, I'm sorry for moving you over there to Oak Ridge. But it was the county seat for Oak Ridge, part of the Manhattan Project, the Secret Cities. It was also 7 miles from Norris Dam, which was the first TVA project. It was also the very edge of Tennessee's coal country. So all of the coal trains were coming through there. And that meant that this little town had a lot of political and economic power. And in 1956, they had had a court case that had been put on hold pending the decision in Brown versus Board. When that decision is handed down, all deliberate speed, which most of the South used to say, we are not going to desegregate ever. All deliberate speed as long as we're deliberating, that's speeding, right? In Clinton's case, because there was a court case, a federal judge said all deliberate speed means 6 months from now. And so in August of 1956, 12 black students walk into Clinton High School to start classes. On the first day, it actually goes pretty well. One of the girls was unanimously elected as vice president of her homeroom. I don't know what that means. She doesn't really either. She never really got to serve in the role. But nevertheless, unanimously elected. Several of the other kids leave that day and say, oh my gosh, this is going so well. I bet we get to try out for the basketball team come spring. This is going to be actual integration. We're going to completely desegregate this school. But by the next day, there had been a massive white segregationist rally in town, and there were ever-growing numbers of protesters. By Wednesday, it was not protests, it was a riot. Several of the black boys are chased through town while they are attempting to go buy some lunch. One of them is pretty brutally beaten up and then arrested for it. By that weekend, there are thousands of white people in the city square threatening to blow up the mayor's house, threatening to blow up the courthouse, threatening to blow up the high school. And eventually the governor sends in the National Guard. But unlike in Little Rock, he sends in the National Guard to enforce the court order instead of to prevent it. And it was decisions like that along the way that meant that, unlike what happened in Little Rock or Birmingham or New Orleans or elsewhere, in Clinton, the school never closed and it never resegregated. And so that is the story of Clinton, Tennessee.
Yeah. Well, I also was hoping that you might help us reflect on the general problem and challenge of getting history right, both as a matter of research methodology, but also in terms of doing justice to the people that you're talking about, because everyone thinks the story that they don't like, that someone's getting it wrong. So if you just help us, think about your process and that problem of, how do you get history right, what's your methodology, and how do you do justice to people at the same time?
My first way that I attempt to make history my form of social justice is that I am an oral historian. And so as a result, I have access to archives. And most people never make it into any archives beyond basic census data. And in many cases, that is on purpose, right? And we can talk more about the archival holes that exist. They are massive. But one of my favorite, he's no longer on it, but one of my favorite Twitter commentators at one point was talking about this idea of giving voice to the voiceless. And he said, if I give voice to the voiceless, I am preventing someone else from telling their own story. And so as an oral historian, I can go in and I can give someone the space and the time to record their own story. And whether I agree with it or not, I can ask questions when I don't agree with it, right? I can push back a little bit in those ways. But everyone I talk to, first and foremost, they have the right to tell their own narrative. And then I have the access that will put that narrative into an official capacity where some other people over time can go back and find that person. So now the people I'm working with will not be the missing. But then my job as a writer and as a historian is to put all of these different voices into conversation with each other. And I seldom think what's right, what's history as being right or anything like that. Obviously, there is good and there is evil. And I think we have to be very clear about what those dividing lines are. But my goal is to treat history like a symphony, so that all of these different voices, even if they're in dissonance, think of it as being a great modernist work. The Rite of Spring, the first time it was performed in Paris, caused a riot because of all of the dissonance within it, right? So it's fine if my story ends up feeling that way to you. To me, that's awesome. That's powerful. That is where far too often we treat history as something that needs to be simplified. We treat history as something that should be easy. We treat history as something that should end in a triumphant moment, and that is not life. And so when we treat history as something that it closely resembles a marshmallow, I mean that in multiple ways, we end up with a story that keeps us trapped, fighting the same battles that we've been fighting for at least the last 500, 600 years.
Yeah, I like that answer. I asked it because you were on a plane. You might have missed it probably, but the University of, what was it, Florida State or the University of Florida announced that they were replacing one class with another, and this new class was going to provide, quote, an accurate, complete telling of the nation's history. And I said, anyone who says that is making a political statement rather than an empirical statement. But then I got accused of a lot of things for saying that. But
I was talking about TikTok earlier with somebody, and I love my TikTok algorithm. If you ever want to talk about how to curate your TikTok algorithm so that it is nothing but public historians debating how we tell history, social justice, Southern social justice progressives, and then one random British woman who owns a nursery and does lots of comedic sketches about that. Like, that is my TikTok feed. I love my TikTok feed. But one of the public historians that I follow is on a kick right now talking about the costs of the perfect patriot myth. And he has me obsessed with it. That's all I can think about at the moment. What we lose when we honor these perfect patriots that we need, when we call somebody like Thomas Jefferson complicated, conflicted. He wasn't conflicted. He wasn't complicated. There were times he was a hypocrite, but I think he was very often consistent within himself. And when we focus on somebody like that, instead of focusing on the people of the era who were actually talking about and debating concepts of freedom and liberty and justice, we're just perpetuating the same narrative. Narrative is so powerful. We are perpetuating the same narrative that has brought us to today.
You kind of already answered this question with that one, but I'll ask it anyway, which is, I wonder what you also learned about humanity, and only because you have this statement. You say history is the story of human beings, individuals responding to events already in motion and seldom under their control. Along the way, many of them end up doing things they never expected. Sometimes they act bravely, changing their world for good. Other times they do injury to the people they would have called friends. And so obviously you had a lot of thoughts about humanity there that you didn't fully share with us. You want to add to that, Annie? Or?
Yes. One of the hardest lessons for me of this book was that I couldn't have people who were the heroes, and I couldn't have people who were simply villains. And that's a nice, neat way of dividing the world. But when I actually stopped and talked to the people who had stood on the other side of the picket line, now I'm not saying we call their actions right, good, anything like that, but they did not wake up in the morning and say, today I'm going to be evil. They woke up in the morning and they said, today I'm going to go out and I'm going to defend my family, my country, and my God. And I had to take that seriously. And the fact that someone could say, I'm going to defend my family, my country, and my God, and end up doing what was evil, was something I really had to wrestle with. And I think that that is another place where when we choose an easy story, then when we tell someone a version of themselves or their ancestor that they don't agree with, they say, well, you're making that person evil. They did evil. Elements of them were evil. But their humanity has to remain. And I'm finding it challenging right now, if I'm honest. Like, I had an easier time with this 4, 5, 6 years ago. The current state of conversation in America There are moments when I find it far easier to say, I don't see your humanity anymore. All I see is your rhetoric. All I see is your red cap. All I see is what you're putting out in the world. And I don't, when we start denying other people their humanity, when we can't say you are both a human and you are doing what is wrong, I don't know how we ever rebuild ourselves.
Since you said that, we're not going to leave that alone. You've got more to say, and so I'm going to jump to what was question 13, because there's an Easter egg, I think an Easter egg, that you're already hinting at on page 242. And I say Easter egg because you just kind of write these two sentences, maybe there's a third one, and then kind of just go back to what you were doing in the book. You say, in our current polarized political situation, we demand perfection of our friends and our allies. Our world is bifurcated, and no matter which side of the divide we stand on, whether we consider ourselves progressives or conservatives, anyone who is not in agreement with us can quickly become an enemy. That reminded me of John Meacham's interview on, I don't know if you probably do as a Tennessean listen to You Might Be Right, by the former governors, one Democrat and one Republican in Tennessee, and they had a podcast, and they had John Meacham on to talk about what's going on with critical race theory and all this, and John wrote a line, your statement reminded me of his, and then I'll turn it back over to you, but he said, I don't have a big army behind me because the left thinks I'm too soft and the right thinks it's too harsh. My view of the country, which is very similar to my view of human nature, is that it's a remarkable thing that just enough of us have done the right thing at just the right time to continue an experiment that's worth defending. So anyway, I called yours an Easter egg, and John goes on quite a bit more with his. His isn't an Easter egg, but I don't know if you wanted to add to that, what I think to be a little bit of an Easter egg.
Yeah. I would also call John a little too soft, but I do think he's done some great work along the way. Because I would say one of the great tragedies of the American experiment is that we've never committed to it. We've never tried. Some of us have, individuals have, communities have, but we've never actually, as a nation, said, what does it mean for everyone to have an opportunity for life, liberty, happiness, freedom, equality? We've never done that. And I think we have to keep calling ourselves out on that and never accepting second best, because second best costs a huge amount to those who do not already have power. But one of the things that gives me hope as a white Southern woman who was raised predominantly in the middle class is that people can change and grow. And I know that we've had there have been moments in the last few years when well-meaning white people at certain moments have decided to have their study groups, right? And they all go out and buy the right books, and they all sit instantaneous New York Times bestsellers that have been languishing on a backlist for the last 5 years will suddenly pop out and become massive. And then nothing changes. And I was getting a little discouraged. If we can all study so much and learn so much, I believe in education, and nothing changes. And then I realized that when I looked at the people of Clinton, in 1956, when this begins, there is not a single white person in the town who stands up and says, I will follow this because segregation is wrong. The closest anybody comes to is, I will obey the law. I believe in segregation, but I will obey the law. But there are a couple of people who, by obeying the law, they put their bodies in places, and when they put their bodies places, when they begin taking actions, they begin to change their minds. And for me, the big example of this is the principal, DJ Britton Jr. At the beginning of the school year, he opens the door for the black students, which is really remarkable, actually, in his era and given what he is facing in order to do that. he tries to offer them protection. He does say, none of my students are dying on my watch, which should be a very basic line, but is more than a lot of other principals give their students. But nevertheless, he doesn't believe in this. By the end of the school year, though, through his interactions and through his actions, through the costs that he has endured, he's begun to change. I forget if it's a decade or about 15 years later, he was actually the superintendent of a school. Oh, it was in 1968, so it was 13 years later. He was a principal or superintendent of a school district in New Jersey. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. The school district explodes. There are fights in the school, rioting in the high school, etc. Britain shuts the schools down, and over a long weekend, reorganizes everything. By the time the schools reopen, kids have been reassigned, so every school in the system is balanced across both race and economics. He has added a Black Studies curriculum. He has added a Black literature curriculum. He has bought oodles, I forget how many thousands of dollars worth of new books for the school libraries. He didn't do that because he had gone to graduate school. He did that because in 1956, he started to take actions. And so that's really what I'm getting at with that. We need to encourage people to take actions before their brains are right. Now, when they say things or when they do things that are harmful, we also have to check them on that. We're not opening ourselves up to getting hurt. We're not opening ourselves up to getting harmed. But we encourage action because that is how we change.
Yeah, I don't want to talk too much, but I will say, as you were, so I'll be quick, which is a hard thing for me to do, but as you were giving that answer, and ironically enough, you went to Dr. Britton, and his father actually was my grandfather's principal at Oliver Springs Elementary.
Oh, wow, they were a dynasty of educators.
Yeah, and so, but I was, part of it just your theory of humanity, and of course you were up closer to it. But that was the question just coming to me, was because of where he was at in 68, I guess, of the year. I was like, well, wait a minute. People don't just change like that, right? And so something must have been going on that he wasn't sharing. But your story is one of change, and so I don't know which. I trust your story better than mine, that he was just holding something back early on, or maybe he was holding back and he changed. I mean, that's maybe a fairer, because I don't know. I mean, that was just one of the sort of questions I had wondered about. But I don't want to take up too much.
No, I think it's fair, and I really don't think he was. Just because of how the rest of his family reacted to the stand he took, his dad is appalled. His dad is just like, what are you doing? You don't have to, you can get out of this. We can figure this out. You don't have to, you try, you open the school door now, you shut the school down and say no riots. And, he had a way.
Did you write about that? I didn't remember. Maybe I just missed it. Did you write about his dad sort of leaning on him a little bit, or did you leave that?
I think I left out one thing we talked about last night is that I don't do a lot of pontificating in the book. I tend to let the story talk and then trust my readers, which is a stand. Sometimes it works. But I think I ended up cutting that. There is a moment when the militant white segregationists are over in Oliver Springs, where his dad was principal, and they start this rumor that they are going to next, because, those Britons, they're next going to desegregate Oliver Springs High School, and his dad is just like, no, this is not it. No, we're not doing this. I don't believe this. I would follow the law like my son does, but like my son, I would never voluntarily do such a thing. So no, yeah.
Later, let's talk about the Hoppers, because after I read your book, I did a lot of it, because my mom graduated with Julia Hopper. But in any event,
they're a family.
So, but let's get back to other things that folks here can follow. So, so growing up in Clinton, one of the stories, and actually I don't know whether I got it in high school or I got it from college, but I sort of got this narrative that it was John Casper's fault. We weren't making that big of a fuss here in Clinton, and then this Northerner shows up, and he gets everyone stirred up, and he's the one that led to the bombing. And as I read your more detailed account, it almost seemed like they didn't want John Casper, not because he was racist. It's sort of like, you're taking credit for what we want to do. You get out of here. We got this under control. So one, I wonder if you have any theory, and you talk about it in the book, like who, there is no who, but like what's your speculation about what led to the actual bombing of this school? Because we know we don't really ever get to the bottom of what happened. So we can speculate here, we can't speculate in the book, I guess.
Okay, well, I'm going to start with John Casper, and then we'll move to the bombing. So John Casper was this Ivy League educated, New Jersey raised white kid who was a disciple of the fascist poet Ezra Pound. If you know anything about Pound, they exchanged letters, one letter a week, for almost a decade. Pound told him who to date, what to read, everything about his life. It appears he had a history of mental instability. He had been kicked out of multiple military schools as a kid. That also, though, may have been code for his sexuality. That is not entirely clear. The FBI thinks that he is a homosexual, but the FBI loved that label at the time. So take that with a grain of salt. Anyway, this Yankee shows up, and supposedly, he has a pocket full of quarters. He lands in town on a Saturday afternoon. He pulls out, or a pocket full of dimes, it was the era. He pulls out one dime at a time and starts making calls on the local payphone, just calling up and down the street in all the white neighborhoods, saying, are you going to let them do this to your school? Supposedly. I've not actually met anybody who got one of those phone calls, but that's the rumor. He was jailed by that Sunday afternoon as a vagrant, and he stayed in jail until Thursday, by which point it was already a riot in the town square. So how a Yankee organized a bunch of coal miners in less than 24 hours and convinced them that they should trust him and do it? In reality, the white community had begun organizing itself more than a year before, when Oak Ridge had been desegregated. Oak Ridge was a military complex. All of the land was still owned by the federal government. And so when the federal government told them to desegregate their schools, the people of Oak Ridge couldn't fight it. They didn't have any recourse because the government literally owned their homes. But they started organizing because they knew Clinton was coming next. And so the people of Oak Ridge didn't fight their desegregation, but they were ready to fight and already organized and had already chartered organizations with the state government called the Tennessee Federation for Constitutional Government. They had already chartered that with the state government and were prepared and had fundraised across the United States to fight Clinton. They had something like about 10% of the white people had already signed a petition through the TFCG that had been filed with the state protesting desegregation. They were ready to go. They didn't need John Casper. Nobody thought it would actually happen. Segregation was literally in the state constitution. No one thought it would in fact happen, but when they see that it does, they all hit the streets. So no, I think it's the myth of the outside agitator. We can explore that more later. I think it's something that pops up all the time. I think it lets us take what is ugly and broken in our own communities and put it outside ourselves so we don't have to face it.
Well, but now I really want to speculate. That part sounds like hard evidence. I'm just really... No,
You just want to know who did it.
I want to know who did. Well, I assume there is no who, but it's like...
No, there's who.
Was there... Oh, so there... But there's... I assume there's more who's that weren't actually caught. I just sort of... Who is...
Oh, no one was ever caught. No one was ever arrested for it. A year before, so the school's actually bombed in 1958, so 2 years after desegregation, which is one of the more puzzling parts of this story, why they wait 2 years, but they have tried before. So a year before, in 57, they had found these 3 guys who were kind of migrant workers, they were born and raised in Anderson County but couldn't always find work in Anderson County, so they would go to Florida for a while, or they'd go up to Michigan for a while, and then they'd always come back to Anderson County. And at one point, they stashed something like 200 sticks of dynamite along the Clinch River in Idaho or California potato bags, which, by the way, is not a stable way to store dynamite. It can explode if it gets too wet. So don't do that if you're ever trying to, hide dynamite. Put it in a waterproof sack. But yeah, so there had been attempts previous to this where they knew that something was coming. There was a escalation of bombings in the black neighborhood leading up to the bombing of the high school, so everybody should have known that this was coming. The actual organizer of the bomb, or maybe his brother, I got conflicting statements, had scars on his cheek. Everybody in town knew who it was. And it would be, I'd finish an interview and I'd turn off the tape and they'd say, okay, now that we're off the record, you know who did it, right? I bet you're going to tell me he has scars on his cheek. Oh no, that was his brother. Okay.
What was the last name? You're not allowed to say.
I'm not going to get myself sued. He's still alive.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, I'll go back and look for scarred face.
Yeah, I am not interested in that lawsuit. Thank you.
That's fascinating. Well, the U.S. Attorney is in Knoxville, but all right.
It's past the statute of limitations.
I wonder another piece of this, which I think is really important for this moment, and I suggested to you earlier we might talk about it, is, regardless of the motivations and what people agreed or disagreed on what was happening, I mean, what I am struck by as a lawyer and many law students here is that that educators believed in enough of the rule of law that they protected the sanctity of the education environment. And of course, I shouldn't say of course, I mean, I think that is a struggle under very different circumstances, but a struggle we have now is to abide by things that we like or don't like. So I just wondered if you might, any thoughts that you have or more you might share to us about the role that the commitment to the rule of law, regardless of motivations, played in protecting, the sanctity of education for the kids who showed up. Some of them didn't. Some of them stayed home. A lot of them, it seems, did just decide, I'm not going. Anyway.
At one point, when the violence is really bad around the school, only about, I think one day it's 20% or a third of the white students show up to school. But no, if at any point all of the white students or all of the teachers had stayed home, the experiment could have been ended, right? Like they could have used that as their own protest and just have shut this down. I am obviously glad that they decided to obey the law rather than stick by their belief in that lovely Southern way of life that they were supposed to hold dear. As someone who also strongly believes in civil disobedience and its power to effect change if wielded correctly, as somebody who really believes that, sometimes you should go get yourself arrested, I'm also a little disturbed to know that there are so many people in the world who will do what they believe is wrong if the law tells them to do that. And so as I see what's happening with our legal system right now, as I see what the courts are doing or what laws are getting passed, y'all are in South Carolina, I'm in Tennessee, I'm terrified by what our legislature gets up to every year. It's horrifying to me. And I think they're only going to get bolder and get worse as we move forward. And so I'm really worried that as a culture, we're willing enough to go along with what we don't like. That changing a law does, in fact, mean that you're changing the system.
Yeah, now you're making me worried here. There's lawyers out here, they're paying big money to get their education. But I would say...
Oh, no, because if I'm going to end up getting arrested all the time, I need a good lawyer. So please get that education, y'all. I might call you one day.
Well, but I think I mean, I struggle with this as well, and I don't want us to get too far off the book, but, you know, I remember, let's just sort of rewind for a moment, why I, as a lawyer, and I have my biases, I was doing a program with Al Sharpton, you know, in the fall before January 6th. And we were talking about what President Biden ought to do or not do to improve racial equity. And we'd gone on for like an hour and or so, and finally someone said something about, you know, voting or something. And I said, look, folks, we've spent an hour here. If we cannot agree on how to count the votes, there is not a single word that has been uttered today that was worth uttering. Not one, right? And so that's when as I read this story of Clinton and I try to talk about the rule of law, you know, civil disobedience is different because they actually respect the rule of law too. They take me to jail. There's a process. They're not trying to like tear down the courthouse or anything like that, right? You know, and so you know, it's in this moment, it's almost like I worry that like we can't even fight for our values because all we've got is just a sliver of rule of law. The society doesn't fall apart, you know, 12 months from now, slightly short of 12 months from now.
It's not that long away. Yeah.
But anyway, I always go very sad. So let's just move
Well, no,
away
what I'm going to say, the only thing that gives me any ounce of hope, and I'm going to be one of those people right now, y'all, just brace yourselves. If we do vote, it's ours. Get out and do it. Make them dependent on your vote and then threaten to take it away. Make them need you and then tell them what you want. A lot of us have never tried to make them need us. And if we actually got out there, and I don't love our choices right now, have real issues right now. Totally understand the desire to just forego what's happening in November, especially with what's happening in the world. I really, really understand the desire to boycott this next election. Make them need us, because then we own them. Then they're ours. So vote.
We talked about the adults bombing the teachers. You know, one of the things that I thought one of the most gripping parts of your story, or what the stories that you conveyed, was the violence that, you know, black folks on Foley Hill experienced, not on the day of the bombing, but on a persistent basis.
Oh, yeah.
People driving up and down the hill, and you know, and as someone who grew up there, and you know, played basketball on Foley Hill and in Green McAdoo, that's where I played rugby, all that. The idea that community was actually able to survive that moment. I mean, the folks that aren't here, like, we're talking about a very small black community on a couple of football-sized field swath of land, surrounded by white folks with dynamite and guns.
And some of those white folks actually live in the neighborhood.
Yeah. And so I just wondered if you could share with us, you know, I'm somewhat surprised that some of the people were willing to talk to you about it, you know, just because it was probably incredibly, you know, traumatic, clearly traumatic. So I just wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about the courage, not just in that moment, but for that community to persist across time. You talk about in the book a lot of these folks who moved off, but I went to school with the sons and grandsons of those kids, and so, you know, the Willises, like, you know, those, and it's like their family stayed and they stuck it out, and it's like, how do you get up and keep going on? And so anyway, you can share a little bit more about those families and their courage in persisting even to this day on Foley Hill.
I think it's remarkable that you're right. There are a handful of the students and their families who flee. The paper, I mean, it's a tiny town, so everybody knew where they lived anyway. But the paper had published their addresses just in case you were, confused about which house you might want to target. And so they were really at extreme levels of danger. But if you bomb Bobby Kane's house, it's not like the house next door is going to be fine. And if you're going to use terror, you want to terrorize the entire community. You don't want to just target one or two, right? This is about shutting everybody down. And I do find it also remarkable that people decided to stay. And I don't have a good explanation for how that decision was made, except they said, this is our home. This is our community. This is our church. This is our family. This is our school. You're not going to win. They sent some of them sent their kids away for a few years until things settled down. That was a very common decision. Sometimes it was only the adults left in the house. But they had been there since 1865, when they had won their freedom, and most of those families did have members who had been part of the USCT. So they had literally been part of this fight. They had already been bombed once for education. They had built, it was a church/school, and when Ulysses S. Grant was elected president, the school was firebombed. And they rebuilt it immediately and started classes again. So I think for them, they looked at this and said, we've been doing this for a long time, and we're not giving up now. But it does take a tremendous amount of courage and stick-to-itiveness. Yeah. As for why they agreed to talk to me, many of them did not realize I was white until I showed up. And that led to some fascinating conversations that happened off tape that we can talk about later if you like.
Well, to flip and jump to another, we'll turn it over to questions in just a second. I guess we'll make this my jump on my other question. So, well after I had left and many others, you go back and there's the Green McAdoo statue of the children. And to go back and see that is quite remarkable. And I just wonder, you talk about, it seems a lot of folks who lived it obviously reflect on that moment, and those experiences are seared in their minds. But I wonder, you said earlier tonight, something about statues. I wonder what effect, if any, the putting of the statues and commemorating that moment on Foley Hill has had or not had on how Clinton reflects today on this history.
I think for the students commemorated by the statues, it is one of the most meaningful things that happened. For them, those statues were recognition by the town that had attempted to kill them. And so it was a big deal for them. I think that for the people, the rest of the people of Clinton, especially the white people in Clinton, they put up a really nice statue that actually other people had mostly paid for. The town did put some of the money towards it, but it was largely fundraising. And it was a nice way of saying, we did what we were supposed to do and we can move on now. We built a museum, we installed the statues, this is finished, the story is completed. And I have real issues with statues and memorialization right now. I got the obvious issues with those, right? Like, we have a lot of really bad statuary in the South. It's terrible statuary in the South. But even when we put up statues honoring the people who were fighting for freedom, who were fighting for justice, it says this fight is finished. It says the story is finished. It's almost like putting a gravestone marker up. It turns it into something that happened in the past when America's schools today are more segregated than they were in 1968. The story's not finished. And we're still demanding that children make this fight for us. The adults in the room are still not showing up to do it for ourselves. And we're still taking this cost out of our children's lives, out of their mental and emotional and intellectual health. So when this is in fact a finished story, I will fully support us putting up a lot of beautiful statues to it, but we're not there yet, and I'm really scared that our process of building memorials is actually going to end up a hindrance rather than a help.
Well, I want to turn it over to the audience now because I could keep going on all night, but I'm sure they have questions, and maybe mine may have ran past these detailed ones. But anyway, invite the audience to ask, come up to the mic and ask questions, and we'll hand it over to you. Can you come to the mic, Mr. Benford? Thank you. Well, for those watching in Charleston,
Yeah, it's not just us.
Yeah.
Hello? Okay, perfect. Hey, how are you doing? First of all, I just want to say I love how you're an oral historian because I had a history background in my undergrad. But my question to you is, today, how do you feel about I'm trying to figure out a good way to word it, in high schools and coming up in the education system, how do you feel about them teaching history in a way where they skip around race, when I feel like there's a way to not make history look so good and nice? For example, I do remember in 8th grade when they taught us about the Civil War, they were like states' rights, when, states' rights to do what, cornerstone speech, plenty of states who have in their reasons of why they're leaving the Union is because of slavery. So I just want to know your thoughts on, the school systems now and how they approach history.
Yeah. I think there are teachers who are working really hard to undo that and to change that. I was raised in a classroom where the Civil War was absolutely not about slavery, right? That was not possibly what they were fighting for. And it took a lot of years and a lot of work to work my way out of that narrative into a different perspective on America and on the world. And again, when we tell such a literally whitewashed version of history, we're creating a version of the past that is not useful to us. And I think the important thing to do is to say, why are we telling our history in a certain way? Because we choose how we're going to tell our story. The version of history we have right now was crafted very intentionally and very carefully, predominantly by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, with a little help from a lot of other folks who agreed with them. But it was a very carefully constructed, nicely tied up narrative that allowed generation after generation after generation to move into a world that looked exactly the same as it always had. And last night I met with some teachers last night, many of whom are working very hard to do something different than that. And of course, right now they're facing incredible pressure, rising danger, new legislation and laws, even just the threat of legislation and laws. There was an NPR podcast a while back. I don't think it was This American Life, but it was one of that, Thinker Story podcasts where they talked to a bunch of teachers who had heard a law was going to come down, about how they were already changing what they taught based on the threat of what might be changing. And I can't imagine standing in front of a classroom where any one of those kids, even if they don't intend to be reporting on you, maybe they really love what you say, and they go back to their parents and they say, oh my gosh, they'll never believe what we learned in class today, and you end up with a lawsuit. I can't imagine teaching in that sort of environment. That's terrifying to me. And yeah, I think that there has been a move in the last 20 years to do the very basic work. I mean, like, we're not even really to a point where we have anything like equality in our historical narrative. There was just a move. There was a women's historian who used to call it the salad method. You add women's history to a narrative like tomatoes, and then you kind of shake it up and say, oh, we did it now. Like, I think we were doing the salad method of history with race. And we're moving away from even that little bit. Like, we're not even putting tomatoes in our salad anymore. We don't need more croutons. So that's my response.
There's some hot chicken on it, though.
I'll support that.
Some Nashville hot chicken. Other questions?
I'm super excited to meet you both.
I know. Is it?
I
can't
think
tell.
so, yeah.
Okay.
I'm also loud. I'm Tierra with Dr. Cook Students. I am very much interested in oral histories of people and places that aren't usually talked about in global terms. I really appreciated what you said just about the perfection, being connected to this idea of a perfect hero and a perfect villain, and either good or evil. And I just wanted to know if whether in recorded conversations or in those, okay, it's off now, we can talk, what notions of help or giving from both sides came out? Because all of this seems like a lot of social movement organizing, a lot of communities coming together for values they believe in, good or bad, whatever side you're on. But were there any salient moments where someone in their mind thought what they were doing was helping someone else in the story?
Absolutely. And it was mainly in the people who ended up changing. So there was a teacher named Margaret Anderson, who was the business and typing teacher in Clinton High School. And she ended up being the unofficial guidance counselor for the 12 black students. She went up to Green McAdoo, the elementary school on the hill, the May before they're admitted to school, and she administered the matriculation tests. When they got the scores back, she went up, and about half of the students had actually tested into the college track, and the other half had tested in the vocational track. So she helped them select their classes, and she ended up pretty quickly going back and getting one of the first degrees in guidance counseling, graduate degrees in guidance counseling, and becoming the first real guidance counselor in Anderson County, all because of this experience. And she ended up creating a really great relationship with Berea College in Kentucky, which is a wild, weird, wonderful place. I'm sorry?
My uncle went there.
Oh my gosh. Yes, that's amazing. But so a lot of these kids, especially the black students who were going through so much turmoil and isolation and violence and abuse, they were finding it really hard to study. Your grades, and we're learning more about what happens when a kid is going through trauma, but your brain changes where you can no longer absorb new information. So even if you can force yourself to sit down, which is hard to do when you're traumatized, but even if you can force yourself to sit down and read, it's not going to stick. And so some of these kids were coming into Clinton High School looking like they were going to really thrive, and were coming out with really terrible grades. And so she created this relationship with Berea College, where first of all, they don't charge you for school, so they were graduating debt-free. But they also would trust her when she said, I have a student who should have been valedictorian. Ignore that C average, should have been valedictorian, and they would accept them and bring them up there and get them a college education. And she's Miss Margaret. Every single person I met adored her. especially within the communities and the families on the Hill. They all talked about how she helped or protected, or, it really changed things for her. A similar thing happened to DJ Britton. A similar thing happened to Paul Turner, who was Baptist minister at the largest white Baptist church in town. He ended up escorting the black students through the mob in December and was beaten up for it, for his actions. He did not at the time end up saying that he believed in integration, but it was the beginning of that road. So there were moments when people looked past themselves or past their immediate family and communities to make those sorts of changes in the world. But it was unfortunately rare. Many more people were just working for those who were right next to them, especially in the white communities. Yeah.
Anyone else?
I was curious if it was ever hard, if you ever faced animosity or skepticism because you were interviewing people kind of on those kinds of stories. I guess what that process was, being able to have open conversations with people from all perspectives.
Yes, it's very hard to build that level of relationship and trust with someone where they are willing to speak with you. The community that is least represented in the book, just because they did not want to talk to me, is the community that was part of the militant white segregationist community. There are a couple of people who participated. In all but one cases, they would tell me, oh, well, my brother once, I'd read the court case, I knew it was them, right? Or my cousin did. Yeah, you did. I've seen the evidence. So they would try to displace it that way, I guess, assuming I wouldn't do my homework or something. There was only one who was like, oh yeah, I did it. He scared me in a different way. But then there was quite a bit of skepticism about me within the black community, and there really, should be. There is another book to be written about Clinton. It was not mine to write. So I talked to about a little over half of the 12 black students, but there were several who just said, no, I'm not doing that. And I asked several times over the course of several years so they would have a chance to see what else I was doing and that I was coming back. And eventually you have the right to silence. And I really hope that they agree to do an interview with someone someday. I really hope that they decide to participate and leave their voice. But it was not for me. All of you, I think, are too young to remember this. But in 2005, we didn't even really have Facebook. Social media was not a thing. And so when I would show up in Clinton in those early days, people would not know who I was. They couldn't investigate me very well. I didn't have a website. There was nothing about me online. And so, like I said, there were numerous instances where I would be in conversation with someone who was black, and we'd be an hour in, and they would have told me the nice, neat narrative of the story that you grew up with, where John Casper was the problem and the white people were nice, but John Casper was the problem. And we'd be an hour in, and they would say, turn off the tape. I'd say, okay. The very earliest days, it was literally tape. Moved on from that fast. But I'd turn it off, and we would have a conversation about who I was and what I was doing and why I was there. And they would say, okay, let's restart. And I would get a completely different version of what had occurred. It would be an absolute 180 in which no one had been kind. The best that happened was that you got ignored. So yeah, it was a real lesson in just the ongoing power and trauma that history has wrought in people's lives. The cost, the very real cost of doing what we have done. Yeah.
As the next question, which may be the last one, so one more question, but as they're coming, just to build on hers a little bit, I imagine though once folks, white folks, figure out you were writing a book and it's going to be a book, they start trying to spin you as well.
Oh, they spun me from the very beginning.
So how do you deal with, again, somebody else needs to be asking me a question, but how do you, as a matter of methodology, deal with the fact that they're trying to spin you and you're that's not easy. I believe everything everyone tells me, so I'm very gullible, but you seem a little bit harder nosed than I am.
Well, that's where you treat it like it is a piece of music. I actually think they really believe what they told me. Now, whether that is because over time you can remold your memories and convince yourself that something that did not happen happened, memory is malleable. I actually think that they believed it from the beginning. I think some of the white people in town thought that John Casper was the problem from day one. But you take that voice and then you put it into the rest of this musical story you're getting. And you say, well, that is one line of thought. But the balance of this melody is going somewhere else. So you can sing your little tune, but your little flute is just not going to overwhelm all of the strings and all of the woodwinds and the percussion section. The brass is there too. You're not going to win.
I'll say, again, waiting for that last question to come in, one small defense in my
This
town.
is like a
No, I'm not
Baptist altar
I'm not
call.
letting them go. So, but I will say, there is another part of this story, and it's not a criticism of your book, that as a young person, we did get an unfiltered version of
Did you?
it.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
we did, and it was quite unsettling. In fact, in my 8th grade year, and it was the practice, I don't know if it's just the practice of my particular teacher or all of the sort of social studies teachers, but and I would be fascinated to get a hold of this and watch it again now as an adult, but they would show us a 30-minute reel-to-reel footage and we knew the names of the people. As children, we were all sitting there with our mouths were dropping because we're like, that's my my next door neighbor, that's I wasn't actually from Clinton, but that's my uncle or whatever. And so, and actually some young people got up and screamed at the reel-to-reel footage as we were watching it. So it was a pretty raw experience for us as 8th graders to see and know who was doing things that we could see with our own eyes that were highly problematic. And so I think certainly I carry it with me to this day. I know other children in the classroom.
Who was your teacher?
Jim Davis.
Yeah, okay. He was the only one that
He's the only one that shows videos?
From what I can tell, from what I've heard from other people, most of the people I've met have said some variation of, I had no idea this was a thing until, they started to build the museum at Green McAdoo, except for the kids who came out of his classroom.
Another thing he did, though, that was interesting, is he turned it on and he left. He didn't stay in there and talk to us about it, which is why the kids got to react and stand up.
Have their feeling, yeah.
And he just came back like an hour left. And in fact, he didn't come back when it was supposed to stop rolling. Maybe he had a video that it came as a natural experiment. It was like we watched it, and there was plenty of time to do whatever and say whatever you were going to say after you got done watching.
Wow.
But I just assumed, as we do when we assume that everyone was watching that video. Well, maybe we'll end on that since I didn't see anybody else coming. But thank you so much for this, and thanks so much to the audience and all the sponsors. This has certainly been special for me to hear about it, and hopefully it's special for you. We've got some books for sale outside. I owe 5 of you books. You can come up here and get them and be first in line to get it signed, and then there's also some snacks and refreshments. So let's give our author a round of applause.
Well, I really have appreciated this, so thank you for coming out tonight. This was great.